In last week's Saturday History video, we discussed how the Korean War got started and what happened during its opening moments. And we indicated, I think, that the South Korean army was absolutely unprepared for the invasion by North Korea. And there were very few American forces there, 20 or 30,000. And they were totally ill-equipped to repel an invasion by a very organized North Korean army. And the North Korean offensive was so successful that they forced the UN forces, the UN because they had passed a resolution to stop the North Koreans, and dozens of other countries participated under US command, retreated to a tiny little enclave, a foothold really, called the Pusan Peninsula. In September of this all took place over the summer of 1950. Then in September of 1950, with the American and UN forces hemmed in at this tiny little foothold at the very southern end of the Korean Peninsula, General MacArthur, commander of the UN forces, executed one of the most effective and fabulous maneuvers in the history of warfare. Sent his forces around the bottom of the Korean Peninsula and came up the other side and landed at Inchon, I-N-C-H-O-N, which was just south of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. He landed behind the North Korean lines and had very minimal opposition as he waded ashore and encircled and entrapped virtually the entire North Korean army. North Korea retreated in haste and basically ran like hell back into North Korea and didn't really stop their retreat until they reached the Chinese border. It was one of the biggest routs in American military history and one of the boldest and most audacious strokes. But it left the United States with troops on or right near the Yalu River that separated North Korea from China. And China issued a very belligerent warning saying that if the U.S. didn't pull back from its border, China would invade and enter the war. And Stalin urged China, Mao was the dictator of China then, to enter the war. MacArthur, for his part, scoffed at the Chinese warnings and told President Truman at a meeting in Wake Island that if the Chinese intervened, they would be slaughtered because they wouldn't have air support. He didn't count on the fact that the Russian Air Force would support them, which it eventually did. The Chinese invaded very suddenly in October, November, and December of 1950. It wasn't until really January that all Chinese troops were there, and it was evident that China was intervening massively in the Korean War. And American troops were not prepared for it and were not able to stop the Chinese troops. They enveloped many American units, captured large numbers of POW, and killed large numbers of Americans. The Americans and the South Koreans then were thrown into massive retreat. The Chinese tactics, of course, were not as sophisticated as ours were, but they overwhelmed us with manpower. They sent in an army about 5 times the size of the forces the U.S. had in Korea, and sent our troops rolling back in retreat all the way down to that Pusan Peninsula again, where it all had started a few months before. And that's where the situation stayed, with the U.S. and the UN unable to break out of that peninsula, and massive reinforcements of additional American troops arriving daily to strengthen our position. One of the things we did in strengthening the position was that Truman fired General MacArthur. He had warned him not to stay too close to the Chinese border, not to conduct military operations near the Yalu River. In fact, General MacArthur had very grandiose plans for an invasion of China from Taiwan and a double front offensive against China, and even contemplated the use of nuclear weapons against China. China didn't have any back then, and Russia had some, but not a lot, and not a really good way of delivering them. So, but MacArthur was really a loose cannon and could really have set off a worldwide war. Truman fired MacArthur, and in a separate video we'll talk about the domestic cost he paid. It really cost him his re-election, I believe, in 1952. and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway, who had been a very successful commander in World War II. Ridgway reorganized the UN and the U.S. forces into a very efficient fighting machine, and then began the process of recapturing the Korean Peninsula. We'll pick up that story next week. Thanks for watching.